Greetings, my excellent friend. Welcome to the Heavy Metal History Report.
Welcome, listeners. I'm your host, Dustin, and this is Heavy Metal History. On this episode of the podcast, we're going to be covering quite a few number of months here because the releases in 1980 were a little bit more spread out than we will see in the coming years. So for this episode, we're going to be talking about the months of May, June, and July of 1980. Now, some of these records are a little on the edge of heavy metal. Some are the early days, some are a little bit more punk rock, and some could be debated as just pure rock and roll. But for the sake of this episode, I feel like the records that I picked were fitting. So with that, we're just going to go straight into our episode like usual, and the first record we're going to be talking about here is Saxon, Wheels of Steel. It was recorded February of 1980 and released May the 5th of 1980. Now, your lineup for this record is Biff Byford on vocals, Graham Oliver on guitar, Paul Quinn on guitar, Steve Dawson on bass, and Pete Gill on drums. Now, on the production side, you have Pete Hinton as a producer and Will Reed Dick as the engineer. That fucking name. It's a very unfortunate name to have. Will Reed Dick. Now, the record itself was recorded at Ramport Studios in London. And since this is the third or second album by the band, I'm going to do a little bit of history of the beginning of the band. So the group's debut album, which was self-titled, it hit stores in the spring of 1979. So much like the band themselves, the label that put the record out was kind of new. And they had more experience kind of doing pop and disco music. So heavy metal and hard rock wasn't really in their wheelhouse. So needless to say, the band's first album kind of didn't do well. And, bummed out by those poor sales and, not really getting what they wanted, they had a high-profile management team that kind of abandoned them in their most dire hour. And, they had a label that was pressuring for success. The members just kind of regrouped. They kind of took all this kind of shit and focused it into making this album. So pretty much what they did after that is they holed themselves up in this farmhouse in Wales, and they wrote not one, but two songs in that time. They wrote Wheels of Steel and 747 Strangers in the Night. Now, there were other songs that were written in that farmhouse that would appear on the follow-up album, but none were as important as those two songs. Other songs that you have on there, you have Motorcycle Man and Machine Gun, all with kind of quick guitar parts and, very fast tempos, especially in the early days of heavy metal. And those songs specifically, you can go back and listen to them, and it kind of points as like a next-gen template by bands like Metallica and pre-glam Motley Crue and even Dokken. This is like the early days of that before the genre kind of like molds and evolves into what it will become. So with that, the band were sent up to Wales to get together for songs for the album, and it was an experience that seems a little removed from kind of the usual rock and roll tedium, so to speak. And kind of speaking about that experience, the singer says, "It was a really wacky time. Our management packed us off to a hut in the Welsh mountains with about 15 pounds between us. It was a weird area because we were surrounded by loads of vegans living in teepees. We used to really wind them up by ordering loads of meat to be delivered. So we'd be in the hut with all these people just staring at us through the window, completely bemused." Gotta hand it to him for making fun of vegans there. Even back in the fucking 80s, vegans were a fucking joke. It's hilarious. No offense to you vegans out there, but, come on. So, aside from making friends with the locals, so to speak, the band actually did get an extraordinary amount of work done in just a matter of a few weeks. I mean, like I said, the first 2 songs they wrote were the linchpin of the whole album, and they were done pretty quickly. And then everything just seemed to kind of flow after that. By the end of what we knew, that they were in like a state of grace. The songs they had were not only the best they could have done, but perfect for the time. And, speaking of that, he says, I think every successful band has that moment when they just get in the zone. And for us, it arrived in Wales. And the song 747 itself is often misunderstood. I've had people ask whether it's about a plane crash. No, it's actually 2 stories being linked. One was a love story about 2 strangers meeting somewhere, an airport, a rail station. It doesn't matter. And the other was a true story I'd read about a plane trying to land in New York during a citywide blackout in 1968. And I just kind of combined them. So it's a cool little story and background to that song. And, in many ways, they had a lot of tough work kind of laying ahead for them, and they had to now take those songs into the studio and breathe life into them. And speaking of that, going into the studio, they talk about what kind of happened there, and they say that we knew what we wanted, and that was the energy we had on stage. Somehow we had to make this happen. The guy who signed us to Carrere was Peter Hinton, and he was very keen on producing the album. I mean, what did we know? We were still very naive, so all of us went along with the idea, and the label agreed. And so when we came down to London, ending up at Rampart Studios, which was owned at the time by The Who. Now, Peter's engineer was a guy called Will Reed Dick, and we took the piss out of his name mercilessly. See, guys, I'm not the only one. Even the band knew that was a hilarious fucking name. To be honest, working with Peter turned out to be a brilliant decision. He got us exactly what we wanted. The album wasn't full of effects, but was raw, live, and right in your face. It had, dare I say it, a real punk edge, and that made this stand out from so much else at the time. And I mean, this album came out right in the beginnings of new wave of British heavy metal. I mean, Judas Priest and Iron Maiden just put out a record about a month before this, and another band that we're going to talk about later in this episode, Samson, puts out a record at the same time. So they're all these bands are just like shooting up out of the ground and changing the face of heavy metal as we know it. And it all started in Britain for the most part. And it showed a real melodic edge. It showed a lot of like speed and I don't want to say virtuosity, but there's a lot more going into the songwriting and the harshness of the music as opposed to like the Black Sabbath, the early years, even the Motorhead, the more rock and roll. And, some of these bands do still have that rock and roll tinge, obviously this band included, but, they're getting there. It's the early days. They're really trying to figure out where to go with it. So it's an interesting thing to kind of listen to. Now, despite the discipline of the studio, the band still found time to indulge in other activities while in London. And, the band may have been from Yorkshire and known affectionately as the Barnsley Big Teasers, which was after a track called Big Teaser on their first record. But they didn't need any help when it came to dalliances on the seamy side. And so speaking of that, they kind of talk about some little things that they got into while making the record. And they say, every night we'd leave the studio and go to a porn club, a strip bar, or an after-hours drinking place. We'd pick up these girls and take them back to bed and breakfast place where we were staying, and we'd have a gang bang. Seriously, that's what we did, explains Biff, as if surprised that anyone would suggest that they were just into tea and whippets. We worked hard and we played hard. So there you go. They were having gang bangs while making this record. I don't know if that translates into the music at all, but the 80s were a time of debauchery, just like the 70s, and heavy metal's a new thing, so why not? Now, the funny thing about this album is the single that I talked about earlier, 747 Strangers in the Night, that was actually an even bigger hit than Wheels of Steel. It reached number 13, while the album itself made it to number 5. And even for a short amount of time, Saxon was bigger than Iron Maiden and Def Leppard. How fucking crazy is that? We know what would happen as far as like history-wise goes, which would become to be the bigger band, but even to this day, Saxon is still putting out records, and I think that says a lot about their longevity as well. Now, to date, the album has sold more than 250,000 copies in the UK alone, although whatever the official figure is, the real one is supposedly about 40,000 higher, and what happened with that, there's a little story here, so I'll relay that to you guys real quick. And basically what they said is, it's a weird situation. We got gold records for Wheels of Steel, and we're told that at the time we'd done about 160,000 copies, but then someone said that the actual number was 200,000. Apparently, somewhere along the line, 40,000 copies couldn't be accounted for. They'd been sold, but never had been included in our sales figures because of an administrative cock-up. I told you, the whole story about the album is wacky. And even funnier, and we're going to close out on this for this record here, there's one last little funny story about that song, 747 Strangers in the Night. And they go on to say, you want further proof that this album is slightly strange? There's a mistake on 747, which has never been corrected. We had a power cut in the studio one day while we were recording. Now, there was a backup generator, but it didn't kick in right away. In that time, the tape on the track we were cutting slightly stretched, and it was on 747. As a result, if you listen carefully, the drums and bass slightly slow down at one point. It's hardly audible, but it's there. And in those days, everything was recorded onto tape, and you literally had to cut it up and remove anything, which could be very messy. So we left this in. So next time you listen to that song, or if you stop this episode and go listen to that song, keep an ear out for it. You obviously have to listen to like a, higher end version of it on Spotify or something. Probably not a YouTube video. You're not going to hear it. And listen to it with headphones and you'll probably notice it. I couldn't notice it, but my hearing's pretty shot. I tried to see if I could pick it out. But even they say it's, it's barely audible. But an interesting fact nonetheless. So, this album and this band was kind of a game changer, and for a point in time, like I said, bigger than Iron Maiden, and that's crazy. And, they even, I'm going to get a little ahead of myself here, but they kind of took that early Black Sabbath approach to where pretty much right after doing this record, they would go straight back into the studio, even use songs that they had written but not put on this record for another album that would be put out later in the year. So the band really wanted to keep that momentum going, and this is kind of where they were at. So that wraps up Saxon's Wheels of Steel, and we're going to move on to our next record here, which is Girl School, Demolition. It was recorded between April and May of 1980, and it was released June 30th of 1980. Now, your lineup for this record is Kim McAuliffe, rhythm guitar and vocals on tracks 1, 5, and 10. Kelly Johnson on lead guitar and vocals on tracks 6 and 15. Enid Williams did bass and vocals on tracks 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 11, and 12. And Denise Dufort on drums. And on the production side, you had Vic Maley, who was a producer, engineer, and mixed the record. Now, it was recorded at Jackson Studios in Hertfordshire, UK. And this band especially is still included in the new wave of British heavy metal. And, the thing about it is it came in a variety of styles, And with this band, it kind of took on another form because you had this London-based all-female quartet. And this was very, new for its time. You hadn't really had a lot of bands that were all female fronted. Maybe a couple punk rock bands here and there. The Plasmatics, maybe, but even, it's not all females in that band either. So this is one of the first all-female heavy metal bands, and I think it's a very important thing in history because it's rare that you see all-female bands. You know, even to this fucking day, it's like you may have like a female guitar player or a female vocalist, but not any all-female fronted groups. I think the only one that comes to mind is Kitty. You know, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I can't think of very many off the top of my head. And that's not to say there aren't many amazing females in bands. I mean, obviously, you know, Angela from Arch Enemy and, you know, whoever's the singer right now in Arch Enemy, and going back to like the hardcore days with Karen Crisis, and, you know, they're there, but they're not as, I guess, in the forefront as most kind of, as they should. They're not in the forefront as they should be. You know, I think a lot of attention gets taken away from them. But this is kind of like one of the first all-female heavy metal bands, and they were part of the new wave of British heavy metal kind of scene at that point in time. So, you know, so few female rockers were available on the scene back then that it was kind of a triumph when the band solidified their lineup in about 1978. So they would go on to make this record, and yeah, I don't really have a lot of information on how it was made and, you know, really where it was made, because the band is kind of an obscure band, which is kind of why I wanted to talk about it. You know, I like finding these little weird obscure records like this in bands. So the only thing I have here is kind of a short interview kind of thing about the band, and I'm going to play that real quick and we'll be right back, and then we'll just move on to our next record.
If David Byrne really thought the world was a dangerous place for women, he'd be aghast at the thought of our next band, Girls' School, who found themselves in among this lot. Heavy metal was the last male domain in music, but one band piqued the interest of Lemmy and joined the hard-gigging, hard-drinking, access-all-areas world of the Monsters of Rock. Why do you think you were drawn to metal? What was it about metal?
Well, I grew up listening to it, you know. The first couple of concerts I went to at Hammersmith Odeon with my mate from school when we were 16, I think, something like that. Black Sabbath, saw Black Sabbath and then Deep Purple on the Burn tour. Little did I know that later on in the years we'd actually be playing with them.
Come on! Nothing to lose, come on!
When you first played rock clubs that had probably only ever seen male bands in them before, did you ever feel that you had to win the audience over?
I think in the beginning people didn't really know what to make of us. So, you know, they just, I think first of all, just looked at us as if to say, what the hell is going on here, you know?
Did you get any heckles?
Oh, God, yeah. It always used to be, get your tits out, basically, you know. And we used to say, get yours out first.
After learning their trade playing sweaty rock clubs, Girls' School received the ultimate metal seal of approval.
There's this little band called Motorhead, happened to be looking for a support band. And Lemmy heard the single, and he came down to a rehearsal to see if we could actually play. And, of course, then they invited us on their first major British tour. We'd never been, you know, on a tour like it, so we didn't really know what to expect. And we actually shared a bus with Motorhead as well on the first tour. So, of course, we hardly even knew them. And first of all, when we saw pictures of them before we actually met them, we would go, what the hell? You know, absolutely petrified.
On tour with Motorhead, were you under pressure to party as hard as them because you were, you know, had to keep your end up?
We didn't find any pressure whatsoever. There was no mentions of cups of tea or anything like that. I mean, basically, they used to bring us in crates of special brew.
So tell me about Please Don't Touch.
Vic Mail, our producer, basically, and then started to work with Motorhead as well. And he's the one that came up with the idea. He said, why don't you two get together to do Please Don't Touch?
Please don't touch, I shake so much. Please don't touch, I shake so much.
It went straight to number 5. We've still got the silver record, I mean, it sold 250,000 and it only went to number 5. That was a really exciting time. I mean, the first time we went on top of the pops, of course, it was massive.
Were you seen as dangerous girls?
One American tour, on the back of the T-shirt, it said the Lock Up Your Sons tour, which we thought was absolutely brilliant. So,
All these innocent young boys coming to see you.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Changed forever.
Yeah, well, I hope so.
All right, hopefully that clip was informative and shed at least a little more light as opposed to what I could say here to you. So with that, we're going to move on to our next record here, which is Accept, I'm a Rebel. It was recorded between October and December of 1979 and released June the 2nd of 1980. Now, the lineup for this record, and you're going to have to forgive me because I'm going to have a hard time probably pronouncing some of these names, but your lineup is Udo Dirkschneider on vocals, Wolf Hoffmann on guitars, Jörg Fischer on guitars, Peter Baltes bass guitar and lead vocals on No Time to Lose, The King, and The Bridge of Save Us. And rounding it out was Stefan Kaufmann on drums. Now, on the production side, you have Dirk Steffens, who was a producer for Delta Studio Productions in arrangement with Accept. Christoph Bono was the engineer and mixer. Manfred Schunke was the engineer on I Wanna Be No Hero. Renee Tinner did the mixing on I'm a Rebel. And the cover design was by Fessel and Hoffman. Now, this record was recorded at Delta Studio in Wilster, Germany, and mastered at Sterling Sound in New York City. So, I'm a Rebel is the second studio album by the band, who are a German heavy metal band, actually. And this is where you're starting to see heavy metal branch out into other countries, and here we have a German heavy metal band. Now, this record, like I said, was recorded in 1979, but didn't get released until about 1980. And it was the first of actually 3 consecutive Accept records to utilize Dirk Steffens as the producer. And, you know, this album itself kind of finds the band continuing to search for, like, their musical direction. They experiment with a more commercial sound than on their debut, actually. And the bass player, Peter Baltes, once again sings lead vocals on 2 tracks. And they're the more slower paced songs of the record. And now, a little funny story about this, too. The title track is credited to George Alexander, which is a pseudonym for Alex Young, who is the eldest brother of record producer and musician George Young and AC/DC guitarist Angus Young and Malcolm Young. All the Young brothers. Pretty crazy, right? And so basically what you need to know is that this was supposed to be an AC/DC song originally. Now, we are going to be talking about AC/DC at the end of this episode, so it's pretty crazy how, you know, this is in between the time where unfortunately Bon Scott had passed away. The band was in like a weird kind of nebulous moment. I know I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but it ties into this, so just stick with me. You know, the band was in a weird nebulous point. They had the song that they didn't necessarily want to use because they weren't really ready to use it yet. And so I guess somehow, I don't know exactly how the band got a hold of it, but Accept decided to take the song and do it on their own. And so pretty much what happened, the guitar player Wolf Hoffmann says that he's talking about how Alex Young got to work with the band, and he says he got involved with Accept through their producer. Everybody after the first record said, we have to have a radio hit. He says, guys, you need a radio hit, and we have just a song for you. Why didn't you try this here? And so the song became the basis for the band's first music video. So pretty much, they were looking for that hit. Obviously, at that point in time, AC/DC had been proven to be a hit time after time. And I don't know the exact reason as to why they went with that song and, they decided to do something that they didn't write. But I think it worked out in their favor, I mean, that's just my opinion. Now, the lead singer, Udo Dirkschneider, jeez, man, those German names, even my last name is German as fuck, and it's hard as shit to say. But he says that he believes the album wasn't too inspired. He says that, I think because of some of the unsuccessful experiments, the band wasn't too solid and the identity wasn't discovered yet. And he also blamed too many people involved trying to manipulate the band, just like on the first album. Now, the band would obviously become more determined in the future to kind of resolve those deficiencies, and it would kind of show through on their follow-up album called Breaker. So, here you have a band that's still trying to find their sound. They come from Germany. They're not quite involved with the new wave of British heavy metal scene, but they're inspired by it to a degree. They also have AC/DC involved in there. So they're like this weird little melting pot of like, man, what the fuck do we do? How do we figure this out? What do we write? What do we want to sound like? And eventually the band would find their way and, just constantly be putting out records left and right. Eventually, Udo does leave the band. They have lineup changes just like every other band, but they are still around. They're still writing music, I believe. I don't know how recently, but I know they put out records. So the band has obviously stood the test of time. This is an interesting album to listen to because you can tell it's influenced by a bunch of different things. I can't really pinpoint exactly what they are because they're so vague and so all over the place, so it's hard to pinpoint any one thing. But kind of an interesting little thing there with I'm a Rebel. It was supposed to be an AC/DC song, but instead it is an Accept song. And with that kind of wraps up all the information I have on the record. Not a whole lot to find, but there you have it. And so with that, we're just going to move on to our next one here, and that is Krokus, Metal Rendezvous. It was recorded between October and November of 1979, and it was released June 30th of 1980.
You've got no real ambition. You're just hanging around. All you try to do is keep from falling down. You feel so sick and tired.
Now, your lineup for this record was Mark Storis, lead vocals, Fernando von Arb, rhythm guitar, keyboards, bass, and backing vocals, Tommy Kiefer, lead guitar, backing vocals, Chris von Rohr, bass, backing vocals, percussion, drums, and keyboards, Freddie Steady, drums, percussion, and backing vocals, and Jörg Nieli, keyboards, bass, backing vocals, and the assistant engineer. Now, on the production side, you had Martin Pearson, who was a producer and an engineer, and Ursula Weber was an assistant engineer. Now, it's pretty interesting because you see a lot of these guys pulling double duty on different instruments. You have a guy playing keyboard, guitar, bass, vocals, all in one. You have, two guys playing drums, one guy playing drum and bass, another guy playing bass and keyboards. They're all just kind of doing everything, and that's pretty interesting on this record. Now, it was recorded at Studio Platinum 1 in Switzerland. So again, here we're seeing another band from another European country, Switzerland this time, and they're on the edge of heavy metal. They're still kind of like rock and roll, like the 70s rock thing, but there's definitely some harder tinge songs on this record. It's not perfect, but it's not quite off base or being a heavy metal record. It's the early days, so you kind of have to give some leeway there of what's heavy metal, quote unquote, and what's not. And for me, I had to go with this record. Otherwise it'd be like one less thing to talk about, and I'd rather kind of touch on what I can as opposed to leaving something out just because it's not quite heavy metal, especially in today's standards. But I think for the time, it's perfect. Now, the band says that, quote, basically, we recorded the album for just 15,000 Swiss francs, which is about $15,000. And we lived in a cellar hole, put everything on one card, and had nothing to lose. We never would have expected that it would take off as it did, and that was all thanks to the fans. Now, Mark Storrs appeared for the first time as a lead vocalist, and the three rock classics on that record, Bedside Radio, Heat Strokes, and Tokyo Nights, kind of open up the doors to charts in Great Britain and the USA, and the song Heat Strokes charted number 1 in the British heavy metal charts. So, the band, I think for that time, spending $15,000 is it's quite a bit of money to drop on a record, especially for not necessarily a newer band, but a band kind of in the midst of its career, and they obviously had the money for it, and they just pretty much put everything they could into this record, and it kind of it took off for them. It was a charting album. It did really well for them, and that's pretty much it. That was all I could find out about the record, is that it sold really well. They spent X amount of money and they put a lot of work into it. And the fact that they're from Switzerland and you had all these guys playing all these instruments, pretty interesting little record there. I guess that kind of wraps it up, and we're just going to move on to our next record here, which is Samson, Head On. It was recorded between April and May of 1980, and it was released June 27th of 1980. Now, your lineup for this record, you have Bruce Dickinson on lead vocals, Paul Samson on guitar and vocals, Chris Almayer on bass guitar, and Thunderstick on drums and vocals. Now, on the production side, you have Paul Chaz Watkins and Bob Brolia as engineers, and Craig Milliner did the remixing at Trident Studios in London. Now, this was recorded at Kingsway Recorders in London, and like I said, mixed at Trident Studios in London. This would be the second album by the British heavy metal band Samson, and the cover art features the band's masked drummer, Thunderstick, like I said. And, that was kind of their shtick, so to speak, for a while, is that they had this masked drummer that would play in a cage, pretty much, and his name was Thunderstick. Now, the more interesting about this record, and the reason I wanted to talk about it, is this is the first album with future Iron Maiden frontman Bruce Dickinson on vocal duties. Now, some later reissues of this record do feature alternative bonus versions of songs redone with Dickinson's vocals, but for the most part, this was his, I don't know what you would say, I guess, formation into being something bigger. I don't know. I guess that's not a really good way to describe it, but obviously all these British bands, there was kind of like a little bit of a melting pot, and eventually you'll see that this member goes to this band, this member goes to this band, because this whole new wave of British heavy metal thing was taking off pretty hard. And Samson was another one of those bands that just right place, right time, and they even have some little things that involve Iron Maiden, which I'm going to get into right now. So, funny enough, the instrumental track Thunderburst is credited as co-written by Steve Harris. Steve Harris is the bass player for Iron Maiden, the main guy that writes pretty much everything for the band. Now, the track is in fact a version of an Iron Maiden song called The Ides of March, a very early Iron Maiden song, which was written during the brief time in 1977 in which the drummer Thunderstick was in Iron Maiden. See what I'm saying there? There's a little bit of a crossover between these two bands. You know, they were like brothers, so to speak. Now, Iron Maiden did release their own version on their album Killers the next year, though Steve Harris credited the song solely to himself, which kind of annoyed the members of Samson. Now, there is a jazz-styled spoof version of the song Vice Versa called Egg Timer, and it was credited to Cosmo Tunes and the Split Knee Loons. It actually appears on the For Gillen Fans Only album, and it was given away for free with the first 15,000 copies of the band's Glory Road album. Now, kind of, I guess, some history about the band and how they formed and how this record got started is that pretty much Paul, Chris, and Barry talked about the idea of adding a vocalist to the lineup, and Bruce Dickinson had actually kept in touch with the band and turned up at a gig in Bishop's Stortford, where he actually came on stage with the band for the encore and sung the song Rock Me Baby. And he somehow managed to get this huge sing-along going with the audience, and he did so well that he was offered the job in the band pretty much immediately. Now, Bruce Dickinson needed to finish his university degree first, but agreed to start rehearsals at the end of June, and it was planned for Bruce to make his live debut with the band at Heavy Metal Crusades, their third appearance at London's Music Machine on July the 2nd. And that's pretty cool that Bruce, especially that day and age, he had his priorities a little bit in check there. He knew that, he needed to finish school, because what if the band thing didn't take off? And, I mean, obviously, we know it would pay off for him in the long run, definitely not school. And, so, I mean, he eventually went on to join the band, and pretty much during the first week of rehearsals, apart from teaching Bruce the live set, they also began to write songs together. So in those first 5 days, they had written the songs Hammerhead, Too Close to Rock, Walking Out on You, and Take It Like a Man. Those songs were also put in the live set for the following weeks to come and the show at Music Machine. And, even though the gig went well, the reaction from people wasn't as good as it might have been, as a lot of Samson fans were not expecting such a radically different sound. Now, that's kind of the thing when you add a vocalist and change up your sound a little bit. Obviously your diehards and regulars might be a little thrown off by it, but I think it seems like a lot of fans kind of turned their back on the band entirely, which is kind of unfortunate. And it was almost a really confusing time for the band, as they felt they had improved things by adding Bruce to the band, but it took a lot of the regular Samson fans a while to catch up. I mean, the Survivors album was scheduled for release in October, when they would also play an 18-date tour of major halls with the band Gillen. And that would start off in Carlisle Town Hall, and that was Bruce's first introduction to real touring, and they were third on the bill with this band called Randy California in the middle. So, they had all these new songs. They were trying to win fans over, their old fans over, and, even get some new fans. So they had these songs. They went on tour. I guess the tour went well. It doesn't really say here. I couldn't find anything about it, but they were definitely taking a different approach to the music, trying to get in with that new wave of British heavy metal sound. And I think having Bruce on vocals was a good choice, obviously. So pretty much after that tour, they immediately went back to Kingsway Studios in March and April to record those songs. And around that time, Samson actually got offered a record deal from EMI, and they had planned to release a single and a double A-side of Vice Versa and Hammerhead, which was supposed to be released on May 9th. Now, some gigs throughout the UK were booked, as well as appearances at the Marquee Club on May 15th and 16th to promote the release of the single. But around this time, a strike at the pressing plant threatened to put the tour in jeopardy due to the single being delayed. Now, Gem Records, which was a subsidiary of RCA at the time, stepped in and literally nicked the band in front of much of the surprised EMI, who subsequently never released the single officially, save for some promotional copies. So they got saved at kind of the last minute there, with this record label trying to help them out and get the song out and get the band, out there for themselves. So eventually the single was released on June the 6th on the new label, and the band undertook a short British tour to promote it. Now, like I mentioned earlier, their drummer Thundersticks plays in a cage, and this tour was where the cage made its debut, and it was in mid-June, and they actually made a short film called Biceps of Steel at the Rainbow Theater with director Julian Temple. They then recorded Angel with a Machine Gun, again, which was self-produced, and they did it at Trident Studios, and that would be released as a B-side for the Hard Times single later that summer. So pretty much they're just putting out all these singles and B-sides for now. And eventually the album Head On, which was produced by the band themselves, also mixed at Trident, was released 27th of June. And it did receive a lot of good reviews when it first came out. And it even entered the charts at 75 and peaked at number 34. So not too bad considering all the competition that's around at this fucking time. I mean, you know, not just barring Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, who put out stuff a month before, you know, even Black Sabbath. You have Accept, you have Saxon, not Samson and Saxon. See that? You have two fucking bands with very similar names, so it's hard to kind of get through all this stuff that's like popping up. It's not flooded yet, but it's like, how do you stick out? You know what I mean? Now, they did start a tour right after this. The tour started on June the 28th, and it was scheduled to run until August 11th, which was a total of 32 dates, along with radio appearances. And the band had kind of been having severe problems all year with their management, and much of what had been set up and organized had been done by Paul and Bruce, and they were feeling that, you know, something kind of had to be done before they could make the next move. And so consequently, they terminated their management contract on July 4th while they were on tour. Now, this caused some horrendous legal problems for the band as the management fought back pretty hard against them. And so they all ended up in the High Court at the Strand in London, kind of fighting it out with barristers. And the band were unfortunately injuncted by the court to cease working until it was sorted out. And so the last 10 dates of that tour had to be canceled. Now, they also had to get special permission from the court to play at the Reading Festival on the 23rd of August, which, although it was, you know, successful for the band, they were not allowed to be paid and had to hand all the money to the court. So pretty much the band were off the road for the next 2 months fighting that case, and in the end, it was deemed that Samson had to stay with the management until February of 1981. Not only that, signing over the rights to their recordings in perpetuity until July of 1981. So basically, they got fucked. They fought the man, they fought the law, and the law won. Kind of an unfortunate ending there for the band that, you know, they had all this stuff that they worked on and they just wanted to get out of this shitty management deal, and they tried to fight it, and unfortunately it did not work out in their favor. Now, after this, you know, kind of in order to keep themselves together, the band carried on writing and rehearsing when they could, and they even had 10 new songs ready to record by the end of October of 1980. And this is when the vocals of some of the Survivors tracks were redone with Bruce. Now, the idea was to use these tracks on a free album to go with the new release, but it never happened, and these recordings were forgotten until about 1990 when Repertoire Records decided to re-release this album on CD with 5 of the Bruce songs as bonus tracks. So, there you have it. You know, the band obviously has a lot of connection with Iron Maiden, both in singer and with a song that was written for them. And, you know, I think if it wasn't for that unfortunate court battle, the band probably could have been a lot bigger than they really ever got. I mean, they had a cool little shtick, I guess, with their drummer playing in a cage and looking like this, I guess, executioner, so to speak. He's got like a mask on, wears a lot of leather. Used to be an Iron Maiden as well, so a lot of crossover there with this band and Iron Maiden. So it's a pretty interesting little record. Pretty interesting that all these members kind of had this cohesiveness and, you know, symbiotic relationship, so to speak. But yeah, they just got fucked by the court, and that fucked the band and fucked these albums and fuck. That's the only thing I can say. Now, I guess one little personal comment about the record here, I was reading a lot of the song names, and if you look at the cover of the album and read some of these names, it feels very homoerotic. There's songs like Man Watching and a lot of this man stuff and Thunder, whatever the fuck. It's I don't know. Maybe that's just me reading too much into it. Not that there's anything wrong with being gay or anything like that. I just thought it was funny the way some of these songs were titled, and then you look at the band, it's like, is there something more to that? Maybe, who knows? But funny little thing there. So that does wrap up everything that I have about this record, and so we are going to go on to our next record here. That record is AC/DC's Back in Black. It was recorded between April and May of 1980 and released July the 25th of 1980. Now, your lineup for this record is Brian Johnson on lead vocals, Angus Young on guitar, Malcolm Young on rhythm guitar and backing vocals, Cliff Williams on bass guitar and backing vocals, and Phil Rudd on drums. Now, on the production side, you have Robert John Lang, aka Mutt, on production, Tony Platt, assistant engineering, Benji Armbrister, assistant engineering, Jack Newber, assistant engineering, and Brad Samuelson on mixing. Now, the band was in quite a weird state at this point in time, and it was towards the end of about February of 1980. Brian Johnson was staying in a spare room of his mom's house in Newcastle when he heard the news, which is about Bon Scott passing, and he says, "I remember picking up the Daily Express and seeing this report that Bon was dead, and I was amazed that it was such a tiny little report," says Johnson. "And the press treated it with such contempt, the tone of, 'What did you expect?'" He shakes his head, saying that, it was just fucking awful. Now, Malcolm Young, meanwhile, was in London jamming new ideas for the band's next album. And he says that, "Me and Angus had already written some stuff on the road, but we'd settled in at his place called Easy Hire, and we were banging a few things out, demo ideas mainly." Bon, in fact, had popped down, he adds, while seated on the sofa of his room at the Mandarin Oriental in Munich. He was staying in London too. In reality, we'd actually gone 6 years without a break by that point, on the road and then straight to the studio. You just did it. Bon was a little bit older than us. He probably had a few sore bones. I'm looking back on it, of course. That's just my impression. But we were down at the rehearsal room, and he came down to see us and said he was just about ready to go for it. He was starting to recharge his batteries. He was looking really good. So, a couple of days later, it was bang. It was a total shock, and obviously, it just took over everything, the whole situation. So here we have a band dealing with the death of a member, a main member, an original member, the lead singer, which is probably one of the hardest things to come back from or change in a band. You can always switch out guitar players, and yes, maybe the songwriting and the style will change a little bit. But vocally, that's such a huge shock, when you change a vocalist. You can get somebody that's close or in the same ballpark, but it's never quite the same, Now, speaking of that, basically talking about the early years of the band, Johnson goes on to continue that he says, "Then I saw the Melody Maker, and it was plastered all over it, as you can imagine, and it was odd because I'd only just gotten to know the band. A friend of mine had got me into them, and I'd seen them doing the Rock Gods Go to College on the BBC a few months before. The club band I was playing with at the time was doing Whole Lotta Rosie too, but I hadn't even twigged by then that I'd met Bon in whole years before he'd supported us." So in 1973, Scott's then band Fraternity had supported Johnson's then band Geordie on their European tour, and according to legend, Bon would later impress upon AC/DC how good the frontman actually was. And he continues to say that it was such a weird thing, and it actually affected me more than I thought it would, emotionally, and it changed my life, obviously. So Malcolm kind of talks about where the band was at after they found out that Bon Scott had just passed away and what they were kind of trying to do. So he says that we went back over to Australia for the funeral, and we came back and we were just sitting around, says Malcolm. I think our then manager, Peter Mensch, who would go on to manage Def Leppard, Metallica, Queensryche, and a lot of other 80s bands, even approached us on the plane on the flight back saying he has some singers' names for us to look at. A list which allegedly included the Easy Beats' Stevie Wright, Australian Alan Fryer, who was in a band called Heaven, and ex-Heavy Metal Kid singer Gary Holton. But I just couldn't be bothered, admits Malcolm. I remember waving them away and just thinking, it's not fucking right, So we waited a while and he kept pounding away, but we didn't really have any interest in the names coming forward. And he continues on with the story, and he says, so we were back in London, and me and Angus were just sitting around doing virtually nothing. I wasn't even playing my guitar. And eventually we said, let's just get together for the sake of ourselves. It doesn't matter, but at least we can play our guitars together and try to get through it. And there was no pressure on to do anything, to be honest. We were just doing it to do something. And that's how we slowly got back into it. And so that's kind of how the story started for this record. They're kind of dealing with, the death of their singer. And then they had an escalating commercial success with Highway to Hell. That was their first million-selling album. And, the sudden kind of impact of Bon's death. The band... Even so, with the blessing of Bon's mother, Ida, they set about rebuilding as much as they possibly could. But even then, that's a hard thing to kind of come back from, and making that choice to kind of continue forward, basically. So with that, legendary producer Robert John, a.k.a. Mutt Lange, who would go on to work with Def Leppard as well, also The Cars, and, just a bunch of other bands. He was already on board after the commercial and critical success of their last album, Highway to Hell, surprisingly. However, Lange really wasn't the first choice to produce that album. The band's label had been pressuring them to work with an outside producer after a string of albums produced by the older brother, George Young, and his production partner, Harry Vanda, because at this point they were keeping everything in-house. They always worked with their brother on everything, all the Young brothers. And like I mentioned earlier in this episode, they had this song that they wrote that they didn't want to use, and then Accept ended up using it, and here we are, So pretty much what happened, Malcolm talks about like who they ended up work with, and he says, we ended up going into work with this guy called Eddie Kramer, who'd worked with Hendrix, Malcolm recalls. I remember he looked at Bon and said to us, can your guy sing? And he was a bit of a prat, to be honest with you. He might have sat behind the knobs for Hendrix, but he's certainly not Hendrix, I can tell you that much. And then luckily, our management found Mutt. So, they had this guy that they were told to work with because of their record studio. He was kind of a dick to the band. Obviously, they weren't really meshing on a personal level, and they lucked out and found this other gentleman with Mutt Lange. So pretty much after that, the band set about album rehearsals in London with Brian Johnson in place. And much to his surprise and delight, he says that, I was down there the night before they told us, the singer recalls. Angus had this guy called Plug, and I said to him, what the fuck is going on? And he just said, stay the night and you'll know in the morning. So the next morning they told us, and I'll always remember coming back down to London for those 2 weeks of rehearsals, and all these people were popping in and out to take a look at us. I was sitting there and I looked up, and Ozzy Osbourne was standing there having a look. Like, I can appreciate it. They all love Bon, but I remember thinking to myself, oh, Brian, what the fuck have you got yourself into? I wasn't scared, though. I was excited. I looked at it like, well, if I do get fired, at least I can tell my mates I was in AC/DC for a couple weeks, and I'd have a nice holiday in London. I should be doing this in my Australian accent. Might be kind of better to talk like this. Matt would kill me. So after that, the band flew out to Compass Point Studios in Nassau, Bahamas less than 2 weeks later. They actually landed during a lull in a storm that actually continued to rage across the island for like the next 3 days. So for Johnson, from Newcastle to Nassau wasn't the journey to paradise he really envisioned in the first place. And speaking of that experience, he says that it was hardly any kind of studio. We were in these little concrete cells, comfy, mind you. You know, I had a bed and chair, and this big old black lady ran the whole place. Oh, she was fearsome. She ruled that place with a rod of iron. We had to lock the doors at night because she'd warned us about these Haitians who'd come down at night and fucking rob the place. So she bought us all these 6-foot fishing spears to keep at the fucking door. It was a bit of a stretch from Newcastle, I can tell you. And continuing on with that sentiment, he says, I remember arriving at night and the customs took the guitars off Mal and Angus, and they were like, "We're here to work. We need them." But they just didn't like the look of us, and I suddenly realized what it's like to be in a serious rock band. The shit you have to deal with. And, of course, the Bahamas I'd seen in the photographs was all white beaches, and when we got there, it was pissing down. There was flooding, and all the electricity went out. No TV, nothing. So we just ended up sitting there for 3 days until the weather broke, and the guitars were cleared. Plug and Keith were down there every day trying to get them back, and eventually I think it was a case of a bit of bribery, and then magically we got the guitars back. So the band is also dealing with more just kind of shit and trying to get this album made. You know, they had to fly out to the Bahamas to this recording studio, and they're bombarded by a storm and, you know, shitty customs agents and God knows what else. And they're wasting time and money. You know, time is money. Luckily, they're not in the studio, but, you know, wasting 3 days when you should be recording, that's a lot of time to waste, especially, you know, back then. So even though they had a lot of the music and some of the melodies written on the road and rehearsals in London, most of the album's lyrics would be written in the first instance by Brian and then edited and added to accordingly by the Young brothers. So while the band were in Compass Point, Malcolm and Angus and even George had come up with all the song titles, and they kind of left it up to Johnson to fill in the gaps. And speaking of that, Malcolm says he was the new guy, and we wanted to make him feel that he was part of the band. He got straight to it. There was a lot of pressure on him. We had a tight deadline and a producer in Mutt who really tried to make an impact with the vocals, so all eyes were on Brian. And kind of continuing on with that sentiment, he says, I remember going down there and there were all these storms, you know. Back in Black was our first time there. It was the best place to do the album because there was nothing going on. We'd sit through the night with a couple of bottles of rum with coconut milk in and work. That's where a lot of the lyrics came from. So the first song the band would record for the album would turn out to be their biggest international hit with the song You Shook Me All Night Long. And Brian, speaking of that song, says, I remember sitting in my room writing that, and I had this blank sheet of paper and this title, and I was thinking, oh, what have I started, says Brian. And I'll tell you something, and I'm not scared of being called a sissy, and I don't believe in spirits and that, but something happened to me that night in that room. Something passed through us, and I felt great about it. And I don't give a fuck if people believe me or not, but that something washed through me and went, it's all right, son, it's all right. This kind of calm. And I'd like to think it was Bond, but I can't because I'm too cynical and I don't want people getting carried away. But something happened, and I just started writing a song. You know, it's an interesting little story, and, you know, maybe he's just saying that for the sake of, you know, sensationalism or who knows what. But either way, you know, we can't really say what's right or wrong about how he wrote that song. You know, it's kind of a weird thing to be like, oh, I felt a spirit, and then bam, this song came out of me, and now it's our biggest hit. Yeah, it's a little fucking weird, but it's a good story. So take it with a grain of salt, basically. So kind of compounding on that, talks more about some lyrics and stuff and kind of recording, and he says, then when we went to record it, that was when I realized that Malcolm is pretty much the captain of the AC/DC ship. Mutt had said, Brian, it's got too many words in it, and Mal kind of looked at him sideways and went, what? Too many words? And Mutt went, could you do it this way for me? And so he got me singing it like, he goes on to like I guess, sing the lines. I'm not going to do it here for you. And at this point, he's doubled up with laughter. He straightens himself up and does his best to look grim. Then Mal came in and heard it and went kind of ballistic. He was like, "What the fuck are you doing? You've taken out the rock and roll." And I remember we took it up to the house that night. We had this little music box and we put it on, and I was thinking, that's fucking good. And that was even before the lead had been put on. So, speaking of Mutt, Lang, of course, would also produce the follow-up album For Those About to Rock, which would present the band with another commercial success, but we're not quite getting there yet. And, it was actually kind of... Mutt was a big part of this record, Highway was always his favorite album, and even though Back in Black was a big seller, and they'd done that album in about 6 weeks' time, and, the recording processes were changing, and Mutt was kind of right at the forefront of that. So, it was like all these little things about recording an album, and having this guy that like knows what he's doing is a big help. And whether it paid off for them, obviously it did. This is one of their like highest selling albums of all time. And although the band kind of would later admit to like frustrations with working with him, because he's very meticulous, but, none of them dispute how pivotal his role was. Johnson especially is grateful for his work on Hell's Bells, to which he says, "I cannot find a start for that song. How do you start a song called Hell's Bells? What do you write about?" Anyway, Mutt knew I was sitting on me Todd and the weather was shite, and there was this huge clap of thunder rolling across the sky, and Mutt came in and went, "I've got an idea for you, Brian. Rolling thunder, pouring rain." And I went, "Fucking hell." And so he mimics jotting lines down on a pad, and then it was coming on like a hurricane, because one was actually coming on at that point in time. And he just went, "Yeah, there you go," and he disappeared. I was just sitting there under this little light I had, and he just come in and done that, and I was like, fuck me, the opening lyric, there it is. And, that title was one of the ones we dedicated to Bon in light of Highway to Hell, says Malcolm. That and Back in Black was sort of our tribute. The oldest title on there was one that George had come up with when we were all working on Power Age, What Do You Do for Money, Honey, which we all chipped in on. So, with 20 plus, 30 plus years of Back in Black, there's definitely like a lot of fondness from the band and a lot of memories that, might have been padded by a multi-million selling album, and it made them one of the biggest bands in the world. But Johnson's only real complaint is concerned with the high notes on the song Shake a Leg. And he says, "Oh, that was fucking way up. Some of those notes will never be heard by man again." So while Malcolm manages to shudder when he draws attention to Lang's brief reworking of You Shook Me, he says the original version, along with Shoot to Thrill, was the easiest to put down in the studio. For Johnson, though, it was Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution. And he says, "I didn't know what to do at the start, so you could hear me having a fag at the beginning." Fag is a slang term for cigarettes, if you don't know, not a homophobic slur in this case. So he says, Mal just said, "Go with it." So I put my headphones on, put a tab in my mouth, and just took a breath. He starts to repeat the lyrics loudly, head tilted slightly back. And, for some reason, middlemen were in the news at the time. The top guys weren't getting the blame. The workforce weren't getting it either. It was the middlemen who were in this gray area. I must have picked up on it and just went from there. And so one of the many rumors with this album that still surround the making of Back in Black is that some of the lyrics had actually been written by Bon Scott prior to his death. And there's still like one or more stories about Back in Black, and, especially with this. And it's not, it seems like it's not true. The band definitely says that no, there's no lyrics. There's just like little writings that they had, but nothing fleshed out and fully. And, take it with a grain of salt. Like, what are you going to do? The guy's dead. You can't sit there and be like, oh yeah, we had all this stuff and we used it and just put it under Brian Johnson or AC/DC or whatever. We'll never know the truth, and that's okay. I don't think it really matters. The music speaks for itself no matter what. And I think that's more important than who wrote what at this point in time. So there's still, one last little story here I'll tell you about this record, and this is a true one. And so basically, Johnson says, when the title track, Back in Black, was finished, mixed, and everyone knew what was going on with the track, Mutt could never see the point to it. He said, I don't get it, anything about it. The music, the lyrics, I just don't see it at all. If only I could even get to like it, says Malcolm, still obviously amused by the memory. I don't think he could figure it out because it was new, that kind of soul meets rock and roll thing. The phrasing on it came from jazz, from scat singing, but at that time, Mutt just couldn't see it at all, where we were coming from. So there you go. You have their producer and engineer being like, no, this is garbage. Like, why is this on here? And sure enough, it's probably one of their biggest songs to date. It's one of those things where the band was in the right and the producer was in the wrong. I don't know if it's because he was an older guy and just didn't really understand the music, or what it was. And obviously the band made the right choice in going on with that song and putting it on there. So it's just one of those things in music history that you get this story and kind of have to laugh about. So I'm going to go through a bunch of little factoids here about this record, and then I'm going to close out with an interview, and that will wrap up this episode. So there's quite a few facts here. These are just brief little things that I found that couldn't really figure out how to weave into the notes here. But pretty much Back in Black was the 8th AC/DC album, and like I said, recorded over 6 weeks at Compass Point Studios in Nassau, Bahamas, between April and May of 1980. After that, the band played their first gig with Brian Johnson on July the 1st of 1980 in Namur, Belgium. So the album was originally released in America July 25th, 1980, in Britain and Europe on July 31st, and finally in Australia August 11th. So this is kind of the opposite of what happened with a lot of their early records. They used to only be released in Australia first and then the rest of the world, or some only in Australia. And this time it got released in America first, which shows how big the band had gotten at this point in time. Now, during the album's course, AC/DC shot a total of 6 music videos. You have one for Back in Black, Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, Hell's Bells, You Shook Me All Night Long, Let Me Put Love Into You, and Shoot to Thrill. But only 4 singles were released from it. You Shook Me All Night Long, Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, and Hell's Bells, and Back in Black. That's it. Now, the album at this point in time has currently sold over 50 million copies worldwide. That is astounding. You don't see that anymore nowadays. And I mean, this album only came out in 1980. So that's not very long. That's like almost 40 years. We're getting like 2 more years and it'll be 40 years old. So that's a lot of records to sell in that point in time. I mean, it's not, 7 billion like there are the amount of people on Earth, but that's a hefty amount, and it continues to sell to this very day. Now, when the album was released, it topped the UK charts for 2 weeks, reached number 4 in America, and stayed in the top 10 for over 5 months. And it went to number 2 in Australia. In fact, though, it did so well in America that Atlantic, their U.S. record company, finally released their Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap album, which they originally passed on, which then proceeded to actually top Back in Black by reaching number 3 in May of 1981. Now, Angus Young, on the riff to the album's title track, he says that Malcolm had that riff for about 3 weeks. He came in one night and said, "You got your cassette here. Can I put this down? It's been driving me mad. I won't get any sleep until I put it on cassette." He sat down and played it all. The funniest thing he said to me, "What do you think? I don't know if it's crap or not." How about that? You have the title track Back in Black, and he didn't know if it was a good song or not. The success of the album was cemented when the band were asked to headline the second Castle Donington Monsters of Rock Festival in August of 1981. And they would actually go on to headline it twice more in 1984 and 1991. Now, the album itself has a pretty phenomenal legacy. In 1999, they were asked by MTV to perform with Eminem, of all people, at their once prestigious annual awards ceremony, as he rapped "My Name Is" over the Back in Black riff. Now, the band declined because, as Malcolm put it, that shows you how out of touch some people are. There is, however, a version of the song incorporating the riff that is out there on the internet. Now, the band was also approached by Beastie Boys about using a sample of Back in Black for one of their songs, and once again, Malcolm said, "We thought about that. He had all the right reasons, but we've got a general rule, and we say no. Why don't they just write their own samples?" So I get where he's coming from there. You know, he realizes how popular the riff and everything is, and, you know, hip-hop's pretty reliant on that kind of stuff, but I applaud them for sticking to their guns and not letting them use it. Now, to this day, AC/DC has never topped the album commercially, or according to their staunchest critics, even creatively. But surprisingly, perhaps Brian Johnson agrees, saying, "I think everybody gets one album, and if you do, then you're fucking lucky. It was just the right circumstances. Everything was perfect for something to happen, and it happened." And kind of closing out with that, you know, Malcolm Young says of the album, he says, "With Bond's death, we wanted to put everything down right. We were really focused on that album, and it turned out to be timeless, and I think it'll stay that way. I think maybe AC/DC has come to a peak at that point." So I couldn't really end it on a better kind of summation of the record. You know, the band was really, this is a grief record if you really think about it. It's a rock and roll, heavy metal grief record. They wanted to do their singer justice, or not justice, you know, they wanted to do something in his memory, and this album is that. And I think it's probably why it's their biggest selling album. You know, you know, it starts off saying they weren't really in a creative spot, but they must have been. You know, they had all the ammunition there to make something great, and they did. And this album proves that. So, highest selling album of all time, right there. One of. I think Michael Jackson's like a little bit more, but this one's pretty fucking close. So I'm going to play a real quick little interview here with the band talking about the making of this album, and then we will be right back.
Well, Back in Black is, I suppose, you got the black cover and you've got everything. For us at the time, it was, you know, we had lost our singer, Bon Scott, and it was as a band, our tribute to him. So we felt, you know, it would be good if we came up with a title that we felt summed it all up, and you know, Back in Black seemed, you know, a good title. And we also felt, well, we wanted the cover in black, and we wanted you know, it to be black. It was more respect, you know, like, you know, if you're in mourning you wear black. So that was our tribute to him, so that's how the title come about, and the cover and the whole album, wasn't it?
That's right. And it was, you know, Mutt Langer too, he was, because he'd done Highway to Hell with us, that was the first album, so when we got to Back in Black, you know, he knew the pressure that was on, you know, because, and that was his real first success as a producer, and with Highway to Hell, so the pressure was on himself too to come up with something better. Which we wanted to carry on, and when we got over Bond's death, we thought, well, you know, another thing kicks in then, because you've lost somebody, and it makes it all more meaningful to us to come up with some good stuff, you know, some really good stuff, some different stuff, you know, something that can really show that we want to stay around too, you know, and the combination of Mutt and with the band and the pressures on from both sides, you know, producers, management, band management, and we had to get away from all of that, so we went to the Bahamas. And the first day, everyone had their shorts on, running around in little mini bikes, wasn't it? Yeah. And the next day, and we'd gone into the studio, and everyone come in with their shorts on because it's really hot there. No one could play the guitars with shorts on, except for Angus. so we all went, fuck this, let's get our jeans and fucking T-shirts on and get back in here, and just like and lock ourselves in this studio, and that way it put us back into the serious side of it all. We had a day of sunlight, that was the end of it. That's right. And then we just buried our heads into it, and we had some already great ideas to go on. So we just worked and worked. There was a lot of pressure, a lot of moments in that album that we could have done without, but it all made the record better because of we were pushing harder and harder for more rock, and Mutt was looking for commercial success, and we wanted harder rock. But the whole thing came out fine, where we were both happy. Band and producer were happy. And I think that's what made it such an exceptional album. There was a lot. There was the mourning in there for Bond. There was, and the pressure. And
even the pressure, like his mouth says, you get to, because the title Back in Black, and and everyone says, oh, it's and the cover's in black, and it's what they're really putting all their lucky numbers out there, aren't they? Here they are, they've just lost the singer. They've got that against them. Not many bands could go out there and try and recover from that, and he says, and then they want to call their album Back in Black, and then they want it in a black cover, and everything seemed bleak.
That's right. But and once they heard, we never let them hear a track at all. So when we actually delivered the album, I think they were stunned
when they heard it.
When they heard the music, then they let this go.
Go.
This is going to be big, and it took a while. Actually, it was a creeper. Back in Black, it crept up the charts. I think when we left, we toured there. We left. It was around 50s or something in the charts. It crept from like 180 over like 3 or 4 month period. And we got back to England, the tour was over, and we got a call, your album's top 10. And it's selling, it sold something like, one of the calls was it sold 1 million alone just in LA. So we were going, what? You're having us on, But we missed all the accolades in the States. We were locked up in another little studio in London working on the next one.
And there was some guy trying to buy my tour jacket. I remember that one. And he's going, hey, I'll give you $5,000 for that. No, make it 6, it's yours. That's when I knew it was something.
All right, hopefully that was a little bit informative for you, kind of finishing off everything that I had kind of gathered together there. That does wrap up the months of May through July of 1980. Like I said, things are a little bit sparse in 1980, so sometimes I just have to throw quite a few months together in order to get the content for the episode. Obviously, once we get later in the years, we're not going to see that anymore. A month will have a solid amount of records to be talked about. Thank you so much for listening. If you like the podcast, if you like, what I'm doing here, it would be awesome if you could take a moment to go to iTunes or, wherever you listen to podcasts, maybe leave a 5-star review, tell your friends, share it, let them know that this is a cool thing I got going here, and follow us on social media if you want. We have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just look up Heavy Metal History Podcast and you will find us. You can email questions, or if you think I left something out, feel free to email me and maybe we'll fix it. Maybe we won't. Just depends. You can email us at heavymetalhistorypodcast@gmail.com, and you can find all of our episodes at www.heavymetalhistorypodcast.com. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, remember,
be excellent to each other. And party on, dudes!